Hi, I'm Eric, and today I will be talking about Generation Me by Jean Twenge. In this book, Jean examines generational differences from the 1950s to present times, and also, by extension, cultural differences and how the culture has changed. Her main idea that she presents is that we've increasingly grown to adopt an individual-oriented ethic over a group-based ethic. So we're more focused on individual achievement than maintaining tradition and worrying about what's best for our family and stuff. It's about getting a good job and being a successful individual. In this book, Jean doesn't just present her own opinions, so it's not all, when I was a kid, I walked uphill both ways kind of deal, but she actually consults the standard surveys that have been given out every year since the 1950s to high school students and college students, so she's always looking at self-reported data, which I think is a really good method for this kind of material. Uh, while I do think it's a good book, I don't think it's a great book. Jean doesn't really introduce any revolutionary ideas, and she doesn't take a strong stance on any particular opinion, which are the two things I look for in a nonfiction book to consider it a truly great nonfiction book. It has to really change my view on something or give me a whole new set of ideas that I haven't even considered. But what she does set out to do, she achieves quite admirably, I think. So Jean's main argument is the self-esteem movement, uh, that we've been worried about making our children feel good about themselves without too much regard for the consequences of what we're teaching them. Like, we tell them, just be yourself, don't worry what other people think. And we try to shelter them from competition and painful circumstances more and more. And while this might feel good for the short term, it doesn't really help them long term. Uh, she gives an example of giving out participation trophies to every child that shows up. While this might avoid hurting some kids' feelings, it doesn't really help us out that much because the kids who work really hard to be really good at the sport feel discouraged. Like, why work really hard if you get the same thing as the lazy kid? And the lazy kid gets encouraged for his lazy methods because he gets the same reward as the kid who works really hard. She goes on for quite a bit for this point, but I think she best illustrates it with a Calvin and Hobbes comic. Uh, so there they are, Calvin and Hobbes are building a snowman. Calvin says, "See, Hobbes, we shouldn't need accomplishments to feel good about ourselves. Self-esteem shouldn't be conditional. That's why I stopped doing homework. I don't need to learn things to like myself. I'm fine the way I am." Hobbes says, "So the secret to good self-esteem is to lower your expectations to the point where they're already met." Right! We should pride ourselves in our mediocrity. Remind me to invest it overseas. I think the snowman's good enough, don't you? And there they are, just leaving it half finished. Jean captions, Kelvin knows exactly why the notion of unconditional self-esteem is so popular. It feels good and requires little work. But really, this is the issue, that we're increasingly focused on feeling good about ourselves without any consideration of the actual reality of it, which I think leads into the next point, is that all this feel-good stuff and shielding our kids from competition doesn't really work in an increasingly globalized economy. There's poor kids in India who are willing to work really, really hard, and they aren't going to be happy with a $2 an hour wage when we make $20 an hour wage out of high school. And our economy is starting to reflect this fact that there's less and less good jobs, and that uh, it's harder and harder to even get a job in the first place. And most of the young people who are going out into the workplace are getting part-time work without consistent hours or benefits or anything. The older people are affected a little bit, but mainly they've been holding on to their current jobs, so they aren't as affected by the economic situation, whereas the reality of the economy is much more reflected in the younger generation. Uh, so while the school and median upbringing of our children has raised these expectations, the reality to be able to meet these expectations is lower than ever before. It's harder to even get a decent apartment or a house. Like, it's harder and harder to maintain material possessions. So this creates quite a bit of disappointment and unfulfilled expectations. She quotes Tyler Durden from Fight Club, where he says, "We've all been raised by television to think we're going to grow up to be millionaires and movie stars and rock gods, but we aren't. And we're slowly learning that fact, and we're very, very pissed off about it." I think that really illustrates a good point that we've been have like all these expectations, but we really can't obtain them realistically, or we only see the top 1% who are able to live out these fantasies, but it's over exaggerated in the media and what we see and what we think is normal, so that creates a gap between our mentality and what we think should happen and what actually happens, and that creates a lot of mental problems. I don't think that's the complete issue, and Jean doesn't like present a complete narrative like that, even though it's sort of presented at the beginning that she is going to explain it entirely. Like, this is why it's happening, but really they're kind of separate chapters to open up discussion, exploration of these things. So she then goes on to discuss about depression and anxiety and loneliness in a modern society. She brings up the interesting statistic that an American born before 1950 would have only a 1 to 2% chance of experiencing a major depressive episode, which is defined as like you can't get out of bed kind of deal. So it's pretty serious. Whereas now it's a 15 to 20% rate. So this 10 times increase isn't explained fully by a reporting bias. And also, like, if you're born before 1915, you went through both world wars and Great Depression, so it's not like they had an easy life either, and we have it so much worse. So that doesn't explain it either. She brings up some causes, like unfulfilled expectations and the stress that causes, that people are constantly think they have to achieve something really big and great and grandiose for them to be worthwhile and to be accepted into society, and that when they can't obtain it, they think they always have to try harder, and creates a lot of psychological stress, that like a consistent psychological stress that can never truly get away from. She also mentions that there's a lack of community, and that there's less and less participation in clubs and groups, and people have less and less close friends. They just have a mishmash of acquaintances. Like, they have their co-workers that they work with, and then they'll go have like the group they party with, and then they don't really have like a sense of community, and they start to feel really lonely. Even though they might be around a bunch of people, they don't have a deep social connection. And that really plays into mental health. Like, human beings are social creatures, and if you don't have that, have like a sense of belonging in a bigger community, you're going to feel pretty bad. She mentions the economy, but I don't think that really plays into it that much, because the economy went crashing down, but the relative rates of anxiety and depression didn't seem affected by it. So I don't think the economic situation's directly tied to the problems. That's what I personally think. She mentions relationships. Again, she doesn't really bring something new. I think, well, duh, people are more promiscuous, so it's only a 20-page chapter and you can't fully discuss such a complicated issue in such a small plate. But I think the most interesting part she brings up is that even in the hippie free love era, that the average bride was 21 and the average man when he got married was 23, compared to modern day where it's 27 and 29 respectively. So far she paints a pretty bleak image of the situation today, but she does bring out like the good points of how developing an individual ethic has benefited society with the equality revolution, that today people are much more tolerant of other people's belief systems and cultures. And when you consider that in the 1960s the civil rights movement happened, like before that, like white and black people were segregated, it's mind-blowing. So that's a great thing that resulted from this individual ethic, and also like acceptance of gay marriage and that kind of stuff, that we're much more accepting of people and their different viewpoints, and we allow them to pursue what's going to make them happy. So I think that's a positive change in society that has resulted from all this focus on individual achievement, because we allow people to do what we allow people to do what's going to make them happy. The end of the book, Jean mentions, like, what do we do now? And she tries to offer suggestions. I don't agree with all her suggestions, but I don't really feel qualified to really criticize or form a judgment on it. I don't really know what's best for society as a whole, but I think you start to see some of the entitled attitude in her writing that she criticized earlier in the book, so seems to be a little lack of consistency. I think, like, she wants government-sponsored daycare, like, oh man, it's so hard, which it is, right? But to think, like, you should just be handed this stuff is kind of entitled, I think. And that, And she also mentions, like, oh, employers should be accommodated to the millennial sense of entitlement because they're responsible for them being so entitled, which I think is, I don't think that's, like, the most mature point of view, but overall, like, she's a pretty smart lady, so lots of the suggestions I think are good, especially when she offers personal suggestions to millennials, like, what do you do? She mentions, cut down your media intake. If you're always watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians all the time, you're gonna feel bad about your own situation because you don't have that wealth and opulence that they have. She doesn't really mention a lot of points that, or she mentions it but doesn't really develop lots of points. It's already a pretty long book, so I understand why she couldn't develop everything more fully. She mentions, like, decreasing attention spans and that people should learn how to focus on a single task for an hour instead of always looking at their smartphone all the time, which I find annoying and ridiculous. She mentions overthinking, whereas people get trapped in their heads, overthinking, analyzing situations over and over and over again. And that's really bad. Like, it's linked to lots of depression and anxiety. So you aren't going to think your way out of overthinking. I think the key is to go out and engage in activity that forces your mind out of your head, where you don't have the opportunity to think. Like, I personally like boxing. When somebody's trying to punch you in the face, you can't really be thinking about your own petty problems. You're just completely in the moment. So I think that because we lack stress on our bodies, that we tend to abstract the world much more easily in a modern day than previous generations were able to, and that causes problems and issues in our own mental health. I'm no expert, though. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Peace!